I want to introduce Steve Portigal. Steve's an experienced user researcher, a fellow former Canuck, and a principal at Portigal Consulting. His work in the space is amongst the best. His two books, Interviewing Users and Doorbells, Danger and Dead Batteries, are really mainstays that you should have on all your product bookshelves. When Steve's not saving the world from bad experiences, you'll also find him hosting the Dollars to Donuts podcast, where he interviews people who lead user research in their organizations. And I'm really excited to have Steve sharing his insights and experiences today. So with that, I'm going to pass over to you, Steve, to get things started.
All right, thanks. Thank you, Scott, and everybody. Thanks for having me here. Yeah, so we're going to talk about boosting user research impact. And here's some URLs for all the things that Scott just mentioned. And for interviewing users, especially if you go to the Rosenfeld book page, there's a bunch of linked resources there. There's examples and templates and so on. And here's the other book, Doorbells, Danger, and Dead Batteries, and the podcast as well, Dollars to Donuts. So you've already got links to check out if you're not aware of all those things. So in terms of just how I want to structure, here's my table of contents for this talk in terms of looking at what are the ways to do this, to focus on boosting impact, engaging stakeholders, having influence. These are all these big questions we're all chasing after, I think. I want to talk about what we do before research is conducted, what we do during, what we do after. But let me run through these kind of three plus sections and talk about what I've seen in my own work and my clients' work be impactful in these different areas. So before here, this is really a discussion of what research are we going to do? And I think at the grossest level, there's a shift as organizations mature, as practices mature from doing user research proactively to the research posture overall is very different when researchers are there just in service of someone saying, hey, we need this. Can you get this? Yes, we can. No, it's too late. Oh, we already have that. Those are all reactive ways that researchers often start out or kind of team start out. And so just one example here from the podcast, when Laith Ulubi was working at Udemy, he talked about a process they ran quarterly and that they looked at the OKRs that the other teams had and then built their own anticipatory or projected what the research asks were going to be. Here's what the teams are doing. Here's what we think we're going to be asked. Let's then look at our resources and what everyone else is doing, what they're building, and then put together what the research is going to be for the next quarter, and then put that roadmap together and then go to leadership and say, here's what we think we're going to be working on. And if you're nodding and going, of course, then I'm envious of you, because I think if you look historically, there was just none of this. It was just purely like a firefighting mode. And really, you can't get ahead if you're just always in firefighting mode. So to really change it, I think, is an interesting and effective way of, changing the game. So as part of thinking ahead about what research to do, here's something that Justin Threlkeld developed, which is this living document that he and his team built to look at what the open questions are. And so this is something that's inward facing, right? Here's what the researchers are thinking about that have come up. We heard this, we saw this, we did this research, we still wonder something else. But it's, I think, a very sort of simple way to track what we don't know. And so think about just having that information on hand as researchers. Think about how you can be more effective or successful in those conversations that come up, whether it's this longer stakeholder-facing planning thing that I just described, or even doing reactive work or whatever that is. Just being able to look back and say, here's what we don't know, because I think there's a huge recency bias, right? The last thing you worked on is really very prominent. But if you're doing this quarterly, or if you're doing it every 6 months, you just don't remember a gaping hole in your knowledge that seemed really important at one point. So to hack that, make it available for the whole team to see. Again, I don't think this is stakeholder facing. This is internal, so you can be on top of it if you're someone who owns or participates in research as a researcher specifically. And so what goes with that is the tracker, and I'll say the word repository in a moment, but here's a piece that Salesforce put together. And I like how absolutely simple this is. It's just a Google Sheet or any kind of spreadsheet that you've got, and just track some very simple questions. There's not a lot of depth or fidelity in there, But there is a problem that comes up, and I think as teams grow, they see this, right? Getting asked for things that you already know. And so there are other questions, and I'll say that more in a second, about how do we get that information out. But even just tracking what you know as teams change, as they grow, as people come and join the team, or people depart, or as time passes, it's really hard to keep track of that. So just having a simple way of documenting it. And yeah, I've footnoted any of these pieces where I can, so that you can see like what's the source of this and read more about it. And I think this whole issue is super interesting when people talk about we need a repository so we can get information, avoid waste, repurpose research. And it often goes into what's the tool going to be. And I think there's just some important questions to ask before that, so that you can design the right solution. So thinking about like, how does organizational knowledge work, or tribal knowledge, right? There's stuff that is believed or it's conceived of, but how does that work? Who owns what the culturally accepted norms and truth are? When information comes from research, who has that? If there is a repository, who's going to put information into the repository? Who's going to maintain that? Who needs the info that comes out of research? And are you expecting that people will self-serve, or will there be a reference librarian? And by the way, this is the new job in research and in research operations, even for the last couple of years. I've seen job postings at one point at Atlassian. As one example, they hired a reference librarian. So I've been hearing about this for a while, that if we're going to have all this information, it maybe can't fall to the individual researcher to be on top of that whole library. So having a reference librarian who can navigate this information and tools and respond to requests, right? What do we know about X? The reference librarian might be the person whose job it is to either know or find out. So that's, I think, if you want to really do this, then you have to do it, right? You have to have people, and you have to have infrastructure, and you have to have skills, and you have to have process. And there's no software tool that's going to do it. So this sort of human role, I think, is interesting. The fact that you see job ads for that kind of recognizes how demanding and difficult this is, and how much value it can bring. How's the information going to be used? So if a researcher is going to conduct a study, they're going to do a desk research and see what do we already know? Are you going to go back and look at what findings you found that you haven't acted on? And what do you want to store? Because raw data is very different than this horrible phrase here, insights, whatever that looks like, reports, interpretations, conclusions, recommendations. There's a lot of stuff that can be stored. And so what do you want to store? Again, who's going to input it? Who's going to maintain it? Who's going to access it? So there's a lot of decisions that have to be made, which is one reason why I kind of like that Salesforce rudimentary thing. Like, it's a low bar and you can make a big difference. And you don't have to answer too many of these questions. But the more you want to build to have this impact, the more you got to think very purposefully about it. There's also, so this is that sort of grander planning, but within a specific study itself, what are we going to learn in this research? And so there's a process that I got from some folks from Workday, I think originally developed at the questions workshop. And so I took their process and made a very simplified version of it here. And I used this with a client kickoff, or we met with a bunch of stakeholders. And we just gave this to them and asked them to fill out for this topic, who are they? And then look at the second column is what decision are you going to make? The third column is what question do you have? And I think the naive way to do it is ask people what questions they have. But we're trying to make sure that anything we want to go learn from research is tied to something that they need to decide, understand, or do. And so, yeah, we did this with a group of stakeholders, and people still throw out random questions. It's not like everyone is decision oriented in an activity like this, but at least helps you structure it. And so we did this with one group of stakeholders, and then we organized, synthesized, prioritized. And so then we brought that to stakeholder group 2, and we asked them to react, not to an ad, and so on. And then it just became this kind of courtesy copy that other people could access. And I want this to be like, oh, look at Steve's suggestion from this questions workshop. Look how great it is. There were all these interesting hiccups. So the last time that I did, the first group of stakeholders, we're focusing on this new community of users that they weren't currently serving, that they didn't know anything about. And so the questions that we got from the stakeholders were, who is in this community? And I was surprised. I thought they were going to answer that question for me, since it was an initiative in service of them. But so we ended up having to hash that out. So we didn't know the answer, and that was a good outcome, even though it was surprising, a setback. So then we did this, synthesized it, took it to the second group, thinking like, all right, here's what we're going to go work on. We want to bring it into them and see what questions they might have, or what other decisions are outstanding. Oh, second group was already coding. They were already building, and they had implementation questions. This was a foundational study to understand a community that we didn't know anything about, but they were in a different state. And so for some reason they were building. I didn't think they should be, but that was way, above my pay grade. But anyway, it did provide, if not ideal, it provided a realistic context. So like, here's what's really going on in this organization right now. It was good to understand this and understand the groups and how we were or weren't going to be able to support them. There's a fuller version of this handout on the interviewing users tab in terms of involving people and participating in field work. And after years of feeling frustrated or surprised that people didn't behave the way that I wanted to automatically, I just set up a process of this very brief training. And so even a 15-minute meeting before the research happens to talk through some documentation that they can have about how the session is going to go, what's expected from them, how they can be successful, how they can contribute. When people come to me and say, I'm just going to be a fly on the wall. Now, yes, if you do things remotely and you feed the interview into a sort of a digital backstage room where people can be flies in the wall. Now you've recreated the back room in a focus group facility, but in person or digital remote, I still try to bring, I don't want a group, but I would like one other person in there with me doing these interviews. And so just setting up their expectations and to have for them to be successful, I think is what a resource like this can help you do. How do questions work? How do we handle turn taking? I don't think it's up. I have an updated version that will show up on that interviewing users page someday, but I talk to people about things like when you're sitting in somebody's office with them, don't take a phone call, don't check your email. Not a thing that I thought I was going to have to tell someone until it happens. And then you realize, okay, I better kind of set expectations more clearly. So it's the cheat sheet, or 2 sheets for how to be an effective second interviewer. This doesn't teach you how to lead an interview, but it tells you how to be along for the ride and participate. So that's been good for me. I worked with an organization where they had a pretty strong research ops function. And one of the people I worked with was their whole thing was like making different tools work together. So we're switching now to what happens during the research. So I mentioned a moment ago, this sort of virtual back room. And this guy was pretty dogged and able to just make all the things talk to each other. So they were using userinterviews.com to recruit and schedule participants. And when that worked, when someone was scheduled, it created 2 calendar invites, and one went to a facing sort of general purpose research calendar that anyone could see, anyone could join. But what they were joining, again, was not the interview. They weren't in the call with the participant and the researcher. They were in a sort of a separate Google Meet. I've seen people hook together Zoom and WebEx, but to do that, it took a person to have to be, not the researcher, it took a person to host these back rooms and make the connection. I think what you get for free, though, is, yes, there's some sort of digital labor, but it's great to have that back room hosted, to have a researcher there to talk about what's happening. Maybe there's something going on in Slack. That person hosting the back room can be the one person that kind of pipes questions to the researcher. The researcher shouldn't be in their Meet or Zoom paying attention to the chat. So to have someone that can be the moderator, like Scott's going to do when we shift gears in a little bit, it's just, I think it's not fair to have the interviewer try to juggle all those pieces there. But this also takes some promotion. People have to be told, hey, we're having these sessions. Do you want to come? Or putting it on their calendars for them, reminding them in Slack, hey, this is happening in 5 minutes, or we've got 3 interviews today. So again, just like the research librarian, to have this impact, you can't just build it and expect people to come. You have to have some sort of human intervention to facilitate and make the stuff go. So there is a human resource investment in doing that. There's a couple of examples of these on the interviewing users resource page. They're just debrief worksheets. I don't think there's any rocket science. I've got a couple of examples there. I think actually the biggest change here is to make time to debrief. So you can use the calendar to do that. If someone's going to participate, spin up a separate Zoom channel, like a Zoom room or whatever you want to call it, as a different calendar event right after the interview, and get together and talk. And I think even if people don't come to it, it's good for the research to have a decompression space. And even if the 2 researchers show up and talk about what happened and no one else comes to show up with questions, it's fine. You're modeling debriefing, modeling space taking around this. And it's great, of course, if stakeholders will show up, other colleagues will show up and talk about what they heard, what they're confused by, what they're excited by. If you want to fill these out and post them somewhere, they become these short form archives. It just sort of models in a low intensity way some of what this process is. Another during thing, I call these like field highlights. And this is very much in contrast to field notes, which are meant to be complete and exhaustive. You've heard like thick description and so on. These words come up. This is the redacted some of it, but this is an actual deep field highlight that I wrote from a client a couple of years ago. I think you want to time box this. This should be done as quickly as possible. This should be like a 5-minute activity. You shouldn't go back to your notes. You're just trying to dump what are some things that happened? Who are these people's names? If you're going to use names in terms of data privacy, here I have just first names only, which is usually what I do. Some of their narrative, something that they said, something that's interesting. There's no conclusions here. There's no recommendations. There's no patterns. It's just here's a story unit about a person. And these go in a Slack thread or on a wiki page or whatever you want. These are low effort to produce. They're low effort to consume. They provide an ongoing narrative that research is taking place with real people and we're hearing stuff. And despite the fact, you got to set this up. Here's why we're doing this. Here's what it contains. Here's what it does not contain so that no one says, hey, where's the recommendations from Alex? So you set it up ahead of time. People can be invited. Hey, everyone who participated in this, what did I miss? What did you see? What would you add? What did I get wrong? You can use this as prompts for discussion. Even if people don't take you up on it, it still is a way to model the way you want to handle this. This gets people excited. Even though they want actionable conclusions, it still gets them engaged. I find that fascinating. And it's so easy to do. It's so easy to consume. And it has this just outsized kind of positive effect. So I strongly recommend that. Here's the last thing to do during research. It's kind of a transitional point from doing research to sense making, to analysis and synthesis. This is a top line summary. It's redacted entirely here, but just so you can see what one looks like. It's like usually a Word document. I think if you do a deck with pictures, it starts to look like a report. So this is very sort of text-based. It's all the stuff that you're thinking about. We had these questions in the guide. What do we think we're hearing? It can be positional. It shouldn't be conclusive. It shouldn't be about any action that we're going to take. It's just it's capturing what did we hear and think. But we're not going back to the data. We're not doing any analysis. It's just, this is what's in your head. And ideally, you could have a synchronous meeting to look at this and talk about this so that people get something almost right away. This is like the day after the last interview. They get something. And so you want to hear like, where is there something that they do not believe or that they absolutely are very excited about? Because as you go into more work producing conclusions, you want to understand like, where are the hot spots here? Where's the excitement? Where's the skepticism? What am I going to have to prove? What's the bar for this next more intensive report? All right, so that's kind of the end of during. We'll talk about. So yes, research gets output in various forms. I don't want to talk about reporting here today specifically, but where does this stuff go? How does it live? I think this has changed in the last few years. I know Evernote is not involved anymore. They switched to a different content management system. But anyway, this is what MailChimp was doing at one point. And I think the model here, I think is quite smart. That they had a standard. Every research study had 3 outputs. So the first was an email that had the key points summarized. I think they got to figure what's the distribution list for that email. So there's some distribution list that varies per study, and it's got this kind of summary that kind of goes in text. The second was a deck, a PowerPoint, a keynote, and that would go to the team that maybe they were serving, but also doing things like lunch and learns, presentation sessions where anyone that wanted could come and learn in a presentation mode what this was. And then the third was a raw archive of all the data so that anyone could go back. This is like the research repository stuff from the before part. So at one point they did that in Evernote. I guess there is an enterprise version of Evernote that could handle that, but they outgrew it. They probably are several CMSs beyond that. Just thinking about the multiple facets, always reporting into different facets, I think is an interesting standard. This becomes more of a struggle to do, I think, as time goes on. And I think other researchers and I have wondered why, where is the appetite for this? But I think this is still, to me, this is the gold standard, is to have a workshop after the research is finished. And I think this can be, you can make a small investment or a high investment in it. This is from a 2-day offsite. So my client spent money on a facility. They took a large group of people out of the office for 2 days, but this was a pretty landmark initiative for theirs. And they wanted to get as much value out of this research as possible. And I think one thing that comes out of this type of activity, whether it's an hour or a half day or several days, is that it's a knowledge transfer and it's an ownership transfer, that the folks that start to say, how might we, based on the things that the research revealed, and start to create, not solve. I think the difference in workshops is that you want to be divergent. You want to explore the possibilities, not just nail our single top 2 next steps. So that kind of creativity, exploratory thinking, and engaging with what the research revealed creates a lot of knowledge transfer. Right now, it's their stuff. They've been doing it. And just tactically, I think I really like to separate the what we learned session, so reporting and discussion, from the what should we do session. It's a very different way of being. You want a different environment, whether it's a physical environment or a virtual environment. You want different tools. And I like to share research and then let it mellow for a day or a half day and come back to it and say, okay, here's a quick recap. Now we're going to get to work, and here, moderate it that way. That's my ideal. Again, you can't always get the structure and flow in organizations the way you want, but I want to hold those out as, I think, an ideal process for me. I think this sort of is part of the knowledge transfer, but just in general, I think I find an important outcome is that when we all come to a meeting with some point of view where the point of view comes from the data, because the questions we're trying to answer about next steps or where to go with this product decision, it's not like everyone hasn't been thinking about it, has been trying things, has their own kind of closely held beliefs based on what worked, what didn't work, what they did when they worked at some other company. So doing something where we all have the same data and we all have the same conclusions from outside, from what users told us, from what research produced. It's a really powerful aligning tool. And I think that doesn't get celebrated enough, that we can align, because it's not my opinion versus your opinion. It's about what the data told us and what we've worked through the data together. So literally, you could have people involved in the analysis and synthesis, which I skipped over in this whole flow here, or just use research to anchor that decision-making, as opposed to what group A thinks and what person B tried elsewhere. So I think the impact comes when you start to model that for people and bring them into these research-focused activities where there is alignment. This is just a screen grab from what one of my clients did. It was really quite fantastic. When you're an external person like I am, and even if you're an internal person, you don't always have visibility into what everybody's doing. And so the project manager that I was working with was just a really great gatekeeper. And I mean that in the facilitating sense of the word, not in the keeping things apart. So she had visibility into what all these different work streams were, who was involved in these teams, what they were thinking about. And so she took a report that I did, and where we were using the research to produce how might we questions. Those were sort of the insights, if you will, these sort of trailhead. And she grouped those into a chart and assigned them to teams. And that started to divvy up the research and hand it off to people who needed to think about what to do next. I didn't have that visibility. I think in-house researchers don't always have that visibility. Someone that can build that and then just say, hey, we did this research, you're here to listen to it, and we're dropping these pieces on your doorstep, and you own them, you take them, here's how we think what the implications are for the work that you're doing. Like politically, I thought that was just like a tremendous thing to do. And everyone kind of nodded and be like, yeah, that's great. We see how this thing that you've called out applies to us, and we're going to kind of take that. In a perfect world, she and I would follow on and see what happened and carry the research forward into those next steps. But I think even saying what happens next, step one, is a tremendous value add. And again, if we're talking about having impact, she really could move the needle with that. Other kinds of things afterwards. This is from a little while ago from LinkedIn, who was running this thing they called Field Day. It was modeled after Hack Day. And so they would have a monthly or quarterly day where they went out and talked to users. And they might have a topic, and they would do a little bit of research planning, but it wasn't for any particular team. It was just trying to have conducted regularly. You can imagine they were quite early in their maturity versus the Udemy example I showed earlier. So they are just starting out and trying to make this thing happen. And so people would sign up to go in the field and then join in. It was like a morning of interviews and an afternoon of kind of synthesis and presentation. And so they made it visible. They had this cool, like completely unauthorized use of the logo. They ordered these lab coats with the LinkedIn logo on it. And if you participated 4 times, you got a free lab coat. It's very silly, but it's playful, but it's meant to make the fact that research is happening visible in a way that's very inviting. MailChimp got pretty fancy about this. They built a marketing function into user research. And then did, as marketing people are going to do, they made jackets with badges, and there's a whole sort of narrative about that. So just think about the story that tells to the rest of the company. In fact, this team's job is to tell stories about research to the rest of the company. So I think that's very exciting. It's a big investment, but it says, hey, we want to get the most impact out of this. So they did fun things that they talked about in this talk I referenced here. They were doing some readouts. They made an in-house podcast, like an internal radio station. They made these very Gen X kind of focused sort of magazine covers that they put up as posters around the office. This is pre-lockdown, obviously, to celebrate this stuff and make people aware of it in a fun way. Again, even if you don't go and consume this research and take in all the learnings, you become aware that it's a resource. You become aware that research is happening. And so you're setting the stage for the next time, the next lunch and learn, the next readout. So you're really changing the conversation if you do something like MailChimp did. All right, so here's the sort of miscellaneous section, a little bit of this, and then we'll switch to discussion here. I think this is from the same Salesforce article where they talked about that rudimentary tracker. This idea, I said stakeholders a bunch of times. We could talk about the RACI model where you assign roles to people. I don't know if that's coming up. If it is, I apologize for being redundant. But what they did here was prioritize their stakeholders. They segmented them. And so thinking about who are the different people we're dealing with, what level of interest do they have, and what level of influence do they have? It's not just a monolith. They mapped it. And so then they made, and I think you could vary how you want to do this, right? But they decided to create a specific strategy for each cluster of stakeholders based on who they were. So again, think about the title here, right? We're trying to boost the impact. So if your goal is to boost the impact, focus your limited resources on the individuals who are going to have the most impact, who has the most influence, who's the most interested in this. You can zoom to that top right quadrant, and that's where you put your energy. All right, so yeah, I mentioned RACI. So if you don't know, RACI is a way of categorizing what roles people have. So who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed. So again, rather than having a monolith of stakeholders, but really having a project plan that talks about what roles everyone's going to take and make them aware at the outset, because we need things from people. We need people to be consulted and agree to be consulted and help us be sure that the research is going to be usable and valuable, and then it's getting at every concern that they have. Yeah. So there's also DACY, and there's probably some other versions of that. It's just fun. I just like saying these words because it makes me sound extremely smart. I hope you're all impressed by that. All right, quickly moving on. This is a great visualization that Michael Kronthal did. And it's not meant to be complete here, but it's a little more of a narrative view of what's the role of research. And I think it can be all of these and others, and it can vary by researcher, vary by stakeholder, vary by project, vary by team, and so on. When you work as the facilitator, you're trying to make the connection between the users and the people on the team. If you're the broker, you're gathering information, making sense of it, and passing it along. If you're the diplomat, you're trying to where there are disconnects and bring those hard truths back. I think we could build other models of these, but in terms of thinking about, how and where do we have impact? What's the role that we play? What does research mean? And what are we set up to do all of these? Do we have one that we prefer more than the other? And so what does our reporting structure, our processes, our output look like if we want to be one of these, maybe more than one or less than another? I love this question, and I don't love this question, but I love that it's an ongoing topic here, especially this thing on the right. Do researchers make recommendations? It's a statement here, but it's presented as maybe a myth or maybe something to challenge here. So is it researchers' role to tell stakeholders what to do next? I think it's very different from testing research, and you've got RITE on the left, where the research is structured to make changes to a prototype very quickly and continue to test. So you're solving a different kind of problem than that example where we're trying to learn about a community of users that we've never met before. So we're not making product recommendations about a feature there. I like to do the workshop because the workshop hands over the power. It's one thing for me to say, oh, yes, you need to really be yourself around this part of the story because that's where the value is. That's one thing if I say that. If I create an activity where the team says that, I think it has a lot more stickiness. I like to facilitate the next steps rather than suggest the next steps. That workflow client that I just showed, where they were a workstream client, I had an experience with them where I was using how I was presenting things that we learned. And I was offering a how might we question, and I was even offering solutions. And my attempt, they were not designers or product people. So I was trying to model it, show it, for instance, here's how you might act on it. And I invited them to spend time with me to talk about what other ways might we do this. And that really wasn't how they were working, but they took the sort of, to me, they were like starter suggestions. I liked them. I was proud of them. I thought they did it. They would be ways to act on the research, but I don't know all that they know. I wanted them to come up with more. Anyway, they started piloting things that I had recommended. And again, my recommendation was just meant to be a provocation, but so I'm complimented by that. But I also feel like, hey, if we had all rolled our sleeves up, we could have come up with more. Maybe not better, but certainly more, and could have done some of that prioritization. They just weren't oriented to doing that. And I didn't see that until I saw how that had played out. I learned more for next time with that team, how to think about it. The thing I didn't throw in here was some maturity model stuff. Here, I think is just the most sort of rudimentary version of a maturity model around research. It's like, how is research positioned? How does the rest of the organization work with the results of this? And I think this reflects things that we've been talking about through this whole discussion here. This is one model. Chris Avore has what I think is the best model, although there's dozens of ones out there. I really like his, and I'm not linking to it here. Someone can put it in the chat, or we can follow up with the link to that afterwards. But his name is Avore. If you Google his name and maturity model, you'll find it. There's lots of these. I think one thing to do with maturity models is that it's a way to self-assess. Where do we think we are, and where do we want to go? And then, of course, what's it going to take to get there? It still is very subjective, but it is a tool to do that. I feel like we've talked about a lot of these things like that. Yeah, and I think Eva Rosenstein from DocuSign kind of said this when we are talking about prioritizing, right? You can only do so much, whether you prioritize your stakeholders. They at DocuSign at this point, they're only going to work on projects where people are agreed to do something with it. They ask them to commit. So you're actually turning down work in order to make sure the clients that are going to do something and thus create more of a narrative, change the sort of the belief structure, are going to be the ones that you work with. Yes, Kate Lawrence at EBSCO just said yes to everything. So there's kind of contrasting. And again, we talked about this already. We're going to recap here. Here's all these kind of tools to increase visibility, increase engagement, increase awareness before, during, and after as a way to really change the way that you're having impact. Yeah, so we'll transition to discussion. I'll show my thank you slide right now. And there's me on LinkedIn, and there's me on the web. Let me stop sharing slides here, and then we can go to our chat.
Awesome, Steve. Really appreciate it. That's a lot of ground to cover, obviously, in 45 minutes. A wonderful overview in general, though. One question here maybe I do have is thinking about the relationship between user research and product. But thinking in that context, particularly around maybe the moments where we trip over each other with regards to maybe the generative research versus, say, the research in the problem space versus maybe the research in the solution space. And how have you best seen those teams collaborate across that maybe like research life cycle, if we want to think of it that way, to get the best outputs?
Yeah, I think I don't know if you're getting in this or not. There is if people don't know that, if people do know this, then I apologize for going over old ground. But if this is new to you, there's a lot of discussion, and researchers, especially around democratization of research, and I think in a way to think about that is what Kate Towsey, who used to be at Atlassian, a research ops leader, she defined these terms: researchers and people who do research, which she calls PWDR. And I think this is all about acknowledging like that research is going to take place. whether you call it research or whether you try to own it. Now, when I say you, I'm speaking about someone wearing the research hat.
Yep.
If we as researchers say, here's what our roadmap is and so on, and here's the OKRs and here's what we're proposing to do, and that may have no influence on kind of what you're getting at, Scott, that people are going to go out and do research. They may not call it research. They may call it whatever, our customer board or check-ins, or hey, I like to talk to Vince every couple of months and see what's on his mind. There's just every form of sort of formality and kind of labeling. And I think the big challenge, so democratization is meant to put some structure around that and some process around that. And how are we going to make tools and how are we going to help these people do better? But right, research doesn't control the activities of the rest of the company. So the Vince phone call or the customer check-in board or whatever thing that is not even on the radar, like it could be happening. And if you were the research lead, you wouldn't even know about it, right? And I think this is where the thing that's changed in the last 5 or 6 years that's much more common now is that you have a head of research. You never used to have a head of research. Maybe somebody else was responsible for the work of research, but you have a head of research. So the head of product has a peer, the head of design has a peer. And so those heads of research can be at least saying, hey, here's what do you need? And here's what we're going to be doing. And boy, if that head of research could say, also, what else are you doing? What are you learning? What are you believing? So that they could find out when we talk about tripping over each other. Is there stuff that's happening? How do we find out about what it is and intervene if there's some skills that are needed, or provide additional context, or bring that into the knowledge base? I think there's a lot that can be happening if there are those discussions. That's much harder in an organization where there's like a lot of maturity and leadership in product, and there isn't around research, because then there's kind of a top down, here's what we want you to do. And someone who's a head of product or a product leader shouldn't understand everything about research. There's a lot that they can be a great person who does research or a person who manages people who do research, but there's just a level of awareness and depth and breadth that they shouldn't be expected to bring.
That's insightful. I think part of it, what we're trying to get at was just what that relationship can look like in a healthy way. And it does sound like a lot of what we can do is just communicate, really, if you want to think of it that way. I want to jump into one of the questions here from our folks that attended, from Hannah. What do you think about coming up with assumptions before research? Her process in this case is that her team writes down a big idea. They come up with as many assumptions as possible. They create then a list of research questions, and then they try to essentially prove or disprove those assumptions.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I want to decouple a couple. I want to tease that apart a little bit. Because I think capturing assumptions can have value in a different way than what you're talking about, because I talk about it sometimes as the brain dump. And it's a way to be better at doing research, because I think this kind of tackles bias a little bit, like the cognitive bias of what we assume that we know, or confirmation bias. So you have this big idea. What are all the things, even you could just say, what do we think we're going to hear in this research? I guess maybe where, Hannah, you're talking about using the assumptions to build the questions. Yeah, I think you could play with the sequence. So I'm not criticizing how you're talking about it. I might just be rejiggering the flow of things. But anyway, if we just sit there and everyone says, what do we think we're going to hear in the research? I think that is a great way to kind of limber up your confirmation bias, to mix some metaphors. We're going to go do the study. Hannah, you say, I think people are going to be really excited about these new features. Scott says, I don't think they're even going to know about these new features. And I say, I think they're going to be really curious about how the product is growing and changing. The three of us saying that out loud and writing it down, like, it prompts a research question, which I love that you're doing that, Hannah. It also just makes us more curious, but also maybe we don't own that assumption anymore because we've said it out loud. And so it really liberates that assumption. Now we go and someone talks about it and we're like, we've got a channel open to receive signal about that. So I think it's just a great facilitative technique. And you can do that without taking the more formal steps of, this is a hypothesis, let's test it. And let's come back and revisit whether Scott was right, or Hannah was right, or Steve was right, or the truth lies somewhere in between. That, again, I'm not saying don't do what you're saying, Hannah. I'm saying, like, you don't need to do that to get the benefit of kind of limbering up. But yeah, starting with the closely held beliefs, talking to your stakeholders and finding informally, less formally than an assumption session. What do you think the research is going to reveal? What are the big questions? I think that's a great way to plan a study.
Yeah, that's great. How do you get teams to think more about those decisions they need to make with that research? So in a lot of cases here, you have teams maybe with less experience doing research. They're really trying to get to certain goals or outcomes. What's the best kind of approach here to get to those narrow decision statements and get them documented?
Yeah, I think the challenge to that lies before that meeting, which is who has decided to do this research and why are we doing it? So I think you could be, what's happening? So if you're doing like Lathe at Udemy is doing, and you're saying, hey, you're building these things, and so we're going to get this research for that. Then when we come in to talk about what questions and decisions we have, like it at least is relevant. There should be some relevance there. And hopefully there's like a burning fire for you, the product team. I'm using you very inconsistently here. Sorry, you and we. If you're the product team and doesn't have experience in doing this, if we're doing this research because something that's going to be happening, then yeah, you better have questions. Otherwise, something else is wrong here. We either shouldn't be doing this research or we shouldn't be doing it now, or it should be a different priority, or you haven't been briefed and you're thrown into this. So I would like to solve it there before solving it in the meeting. I think there is some facilitation that the person running that meeting can do. The more you do research, the more you start to understand, okay, I'd want to learn what are their expectations, what are their behaviors, and so on. I might start throwing stuff out to see if I could prompt a decision, but that feels like a very uphill meeting. If the meeting is what decisions do you have to make? I don't know. We could learn about what people's expectations for features are. Do you want to know that? It feels like we should have realigned before that. So I don't know. I'm going to punt on your question a little bit and say, like, we should avoid getting into that thing ahead of time. And the people that are planning this research and that have brought that team into the meeting should agree that this is important and these people need to know what they're doing. And it is on them and their management to make sure they're set up for success there, not the kind of researchers holding that meeting. That's my pushback on the question.
Another question here from Shannon. How do you think about the process of identifying users for research and kind of bringing them in? So I think the challenge here obviously is like in some applications, it's really easy to get to the users. They're right there. Maybe you can talk to them. Maybe they're in close proximity. But in a lot of cases, B2B and B2C particularly, like some of that stuff the access might be a little more difficult or challenging. So what's that look like? How can you essentially get that to a good space where maybe you have a good pipeline, good attendance, and good outcomes on that side?
Pointers to two articles, which I can't summarize, but I know exist. They're both about finding kind of enterprise users when sort of sales owns those relationships. I think that's what the thesis of both these articles are. And someone can Google them and find them. They're both pretty recent. One is by Teresa Torres, and one is by Jeff Gothelf. They've both written, I think, pretty solid articles about the mechanics of doing that. But your kind of focus here is on like, how do we even think about it? And I think there are all these ways to divvy up a sample. I like to think about, once you have this research question, I like to think about who are people that can give us a perspective on this question. It shouldn't literally be who are the customers. This varies if you have 3 customers or 300. There's a lot of different ways to think about it. But here's a behavior that we're interested in. So who are people that can give us a perspective on it? That could be people that should be using our product but aren't, not to sell to them, but understand how are they doing it without a product? What do the other solutions look like? Who are people that have used our product and have stopped using our products? Not just to test the sales or value prop, but they have a different relationship to the benefit that our tools provide. Who are people that use our competitors' products? Again, not just to poach them, but to understand what are other ways through this. Who are lead users? If our thing is set up for people to build a workflow with 3 components, who's somebody that's built a workflow with like 27 components? Like when you're at that level of usage, like how are you seeing these tools and seeing these problems? So it's a big disconnect between who do we want to build for? I think the assumption is always we talk to the people that we want to build for, because that's who we're going to build for. So we have to understand them. But what your sample can do is create contrast. The cliche here is whoever discovered water, it wasn't fish. You can't see if every customer says, yeah, we use the builder, then we add this, then we use this dropdown, then we export it into Excel, and then we ship it off to our account manager. Until you're kind of just going to be like, until you see the person that says, oh yeah, I make some pipeline with Yahoo pipes and then do this and do that. Then I save it. And then I have my dog right over it. you don't realize that, oh, wow, this is all taking place through, you have some insight. I can't make up a fake one very well here, but you don't see the things that are in common among your target until you talk to somebody outside that. So I think about these sort of outliers as salt and pepper to put it into your mix. You want to just spice it up a little bit to create some contrast, to give you the power to see something that you hadn't seen before. I think that is a more creative sampling thing. And I think even if you just say who we research is not the same as who we are building for, I think that puts you so far ahead of what the default assumptions are in research sampling.
Yeah, that's great, Steve. I know we've only got a couple more minutes here, maybe one really quick question and kind of answer, but we spoke a little bit about the democratization of research and the PWDR model from Kate Townsend. There's a question here from Rashika. What are your views on it leading to a perceived transferability of research to other like roles like product, design, et cetera? And the current landscape of lots of researchers and research teams being laid off and what that kind of maybe means for research overall.
Yeah, that's a great question. Because yes, the researchers taking jobs in product is like weak signal on that. But I think you hear about these people all the time because that's where the influence is. That's where the thing I've been trying to do with research. Some researchers, they're born to research, and some researchers are there to help make decisions. So we probably could segment researchers that's up for. Does democratization help with that sort of transferability? I have never thought about that. I want to say, yes, it normalizes and socializes the process of research. And if research is a thing that we do, then yes, I think bringing it from one part of the organization into another. And I definitely know people who are like, they were head of research and then they became head of product. They kind of moved very differently laterally as a head of. So that's really good. I don't know. I think you should write about that. That's like an interesting thing to explore. The question answers itself. And I think there's a blog post there.
Yeah, that's awesome. Steve, really appreciate it. I know it's a ton of time goes into these things, and I really appreciate your experience and insights. We're going to wrap things up here. Just a quick reminder for folks in the chat. I have shared a link to our post-event survey. I know we'd love to give Steve some feedback on the session, and we always welcome the feedback as well. So please do take a moment to fill that out. You can also win one of our monthly prizes that we give away. We definitely encourage you to continue the conversation in our community. If you have questions afterwards, or you want to talk just about any of the topics here, a great place to start that discussion. And we've got lots of different events coming up next week, Roundtable, as well as our event with Jay Filitro on product-led growth. And we've got Roman Pilcher and a bunch of other folks coming up as well in the coming months ahead. And if you do want to speak or have something that you want to share from your expertise and experience, please do take the time. We'd love to hear from you. You can find out about how to become a speaker here by searching for Speak within the community. And we'd love to have you and explore any topics that you might have to contribute to. With that, thanks very much, everybody, for joining us. And thank you, Steve, again, for your time and energy. Really appreciate it. And wishing you all the best, and have a safe Thursday and a good long weekend. Take care.